IVM.
What does it take to become a deputy governor of the Reserve Bank of India? What do you do when you're in charge of a central bank's monetary policy, its research, its public face, and more? Viral Acharya returns to the Pragati podcast in the second of his 2 episodes on the show. Viral is the C.V. Starr Professor of Economics at the Stern School of Business at New York University. He was a deputy governor at the RBI from January 2017 to June 2019 and has recently published his book, The Quest for Restoring Financial Stability in India. Previously on episode 153, Viral had spoken to us about understanding India's persistent non-performing assets or NPA problem and had laid out how and why the banking sector is in urgent need of reform for a financially stable Indian economy. The link to check out his book is on our interactive players as well as in the episode description. Before recording these 2 episodes, I had reached out and asked for questions from all of you that I could pose to Viral. My thanks again to the 45 or so people who responded and shared some excellent questions. I got a chance to ask Viral about 4 of these questions across the previous episode and this one. Ankur Garg, Dayanidhi Krishna, Anua Chakrabarti and Sai Krishna will all have their questions featured and will each be getting a copy of Viral's book. Once again, thank you for participating. And this was very much an experiment and I hope to do a lot more of this over the coming weeks and months. Just before we begin, a little reminder. The Pragati podcast is now more than just audio and each episode contains interactive in-audio polls, links, references, and more. Listen to this episode on the IVM Podcast Android app, the Adori iOS app, or on your mobile or web browsers for the full experience. Visit tiny.cc/pragati154 to try it out right now. Welcome to the Pragati Podcast, a weekly talk show on public policy, economics, and international relations. We take a step back from noisy political debates and dive into rich conversations on India and the world. I am your host, Pavan Srinath. We'll start this episode's conversation after a short break.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to another great week on the IVM Podcast Network. If you're not following us on social media, please do. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. I want to let you all know about 2 new shows that we've launched this week. The first one is Millennial Athlete, hosted by Tanvi and Shlok. Both of them are, they spent their life playing badminton, and they know a lot of athletes, and they want to talk about the particular challenges that athletes face. Really, really great conversations. Do definitely check that out. The other show that I wanted to mention to you that we launched this week is Non-Curry. Non-Curry is a show about it's about food and the history of food and the economics around food and its consumption and all that kind of stuff. It's a really, really interesting conversation. It's hosted by Sadaf, he's an author chef and former MasterChef India finalist, and Archit, who is a researcher who writes on behavioral science and economics. Definitely worth checking out. Besides that, we had a great week as always, right? Great stuff on all the normal shows. Do check those out. But with that, let me get you back to your show.
Hi, I'm Pavan Srinath and welcome to the Pragati podcast. Today we have Viral Acharya coming in the second of 2 episodes that we are recording with him. And in the last episode, Viral, thank you so much for giving us a great sort of tour de force into the bank and the non-performing asset problem and how all we ought to be thinking about it and what are we doing to fix some of it. Viral, thank you for joining me again today on our second episode.
My pleasure, Pavan. I'm looking forward to talking more about my role at the RBI and more generally a deputy governor's role at the RBI.
Certainly. And, I think like in your other podcasts elsewhere, there's been a lot of discussion on various aspects of monetary policy. So I thought that's why I really wanted to focus on one thing that is still shrouded in a bit of mystery. There's mystique. There's also not much that the rest of us often know. You have been a well-regarded finance and economics professor and researcher for a while, right? I mean, you have some excellent publications. You've been working with central banks across the world. How do you become a RBI deputy governor? How does anyone become one if they're not within the RBI or government system already?
See, there's a bit of planning, I would say, and of course, there has to be some luck in all these matters. What is the planning? The planning is that you have to prepare yourself for these jobs. You have to study banking and monetary policy and other functions of the central bank in great depth. In my view, this should involve not just studying India, it should actually involve studying economic history of India as well as of other countries, because it's only then that you internalize how to solve problems that are arising in a given country, such as India. The value of academic research very often is not that it makes you smarter or more intelligent. That's inside you. What it does is that it gives you frameworks to organize your thoughts. It gives you problem-solving methods. It makes you aware of the intended and the unintended consequences of the economy. Very early on in our first podcast, you explained that the problem with macroeconomy is that you try to do something to one part and there are spillovers on all other parts. There are feedbacks. And very often the end result is not what you wanted in the first place. And it gets very complex very soon. And you need organizing frameworks to think about all these channels through which a public policy through the central bank plays out in the economy. And public policies interact. Monetary policy interacts with fiscal policy, sometimes in the right way, sometimes in the wrong way. So you have to understand all of these things. You have to bring data to the table and at the same time use the conceptual frameworks to theoretically organize your thought processes. You also have to engage with regulatory bodies in India, maybe in some research capacity or advisory capacity, so you become a known entity, and also that you familiarize yourself with how the system works, what the challenges are, and so on.
So what was your first personal engagement or interaction this way with any central bank and with the RBI in particular, Viral? How long ago was that?
No, actually, I've been involved with in advisory capacity with central banks since at least 15 years. I was involved with Bank of England as an academic advisor when I was at London Business School. So this was 2005, 2006, etc. Then when I moved back to New York University as a professor, I started engagement with several Federal Reserves, in particular Federal Reserve Bank of New York, Philadelphia, Cleveland, the Board of Governors in Washington, D.C. I was on the Systemic Risk Board as an academic advisor for the European banking system, and, several other such positions. In India, I was involved as an international advisory committee of the Securities Exchange Board. I was involved with the Reserve Bank of India's supported finance research arm, CAFREL. So, I was doing some research with the researchers at CAFREL. I set up an India Center for studying Indian capital markets at NYU, which is funded by the National Stock Exchange and which does an annual flagship conference in collaboration with IIM Kolkata. So, there were so many different parts of the system, the financial regulatory system outside India and inside India that I had exposure to. And increasingly, post-global financial crisis, I started doing a lot more research on India, not always in an academic capacity, but I would say at a semi-academic capacity. So, like putting out chapters in books produced by think tanks in India and so on. So I would say I very much felt part of the system. I know there is a group of people in India who think, these are just foreign trained economists who come from nowhere into the system and they have no idea. And I think one thing I would stress is that when people like me come to India, work at the central bank, it's not that we are working in a vacuum. RBI has, 14,000 plus employees and, at least 1,000 to 2,000 of them are working very closely in the areas where the top management is working in. And, there is interaction. And the value of having a few people like us in the system is that you avoid groupthink. You avoid thinking and getting trapped into Indian exceptionalism. You know what the global best standards are. On the job, of course, what you have learned outside, what you have learned about India gets refined with the knowledge of people who have been in the Indian system for a very long time. But it cuts both ways. Sometimes I find people who have been all the time in India are never able to think beyond the solutions that have been adopted in India. They somehow think that this is the way things have been. They almost have a certain level of inertia I would say even cynicism to whether reforms can actually be brought about. But it's only when you go out and look at India from outside, it is possible to objectively judge what is missing from the toolkit altogether and then propose some reform. And in fact, I would contend that sometimes there are parts of India that look more beautiful from outside India than they are inside India. My screensaver image is this famous image called Earthrise. One of the Apollo missions, they took a photograph of Earth from when they were outside Moon. That's the best way to see Earth. It's from outside. It's not by living on Earth.
Yeah, you don't get to see the potholes and the traffic and the air pollution when you're looking at it from that far away, right? Absolutely.
Yeah. So I think we bring a lot of diversity of thinking, a certain level of understanding of global best practices and standards. And that experience is as useful along with the experience of India that people who have been in India for a period of time have. The two need to work together. We need to bring all the best minds we can to the table to reach the right decisions. That's how I see it. It doesn't matter whether you are abroad, whether you are in India, as long as you are bringing best minds to the table to solve the most important problems with an open mind to reaching the correct solutions, I think we can move to a better place.
Absolutely. And, I was counting, I think there were 56 RBI deputy governors, I think, before you. I mean, this is just from the RBI website. And I think now there are probably about 58 or 59 who've served office, including those who are currently in office. So we know somewhat about the role of the RBI governor, right? I wouldn't presume that public knowledge about the role of the governor is very high, but what was your role? If I'm not mistaken, you were the deputy governor in charge of monetary policy as well, right? And typically that role, at least a lot of the times, has gone to an economist. Would that be fair?
Yeah, in fact, and very often it has gone to an outside economist, actually.
Okay.
And I think that was because the Reserve Bank of India and the government of India recognized the value of bringing some outside expertise into this function, maybe to uphold the highest research standards, to avoid the groupthink, as I mentioned, and so on. Of course, I was in charge of other areas as well.
So what was your formal mandate?
The formal mandate was monetary policy, research, and then markets, which included the liquidity operations as well as the FX markets. Then, over time, I was also doing human resource management for a time. For a while, I was doing financial stability also as a part of the function, and, a few other functions on the side. See, as Dr. Rakesh Mohan, a former deputy governor of the RBI, told me before I took the job, I had a chat with him in the week before leaving for India. He said, this is the best job at the RBI. And in a way, he is right, which is that, you are not so much into the political mix of things, with all the back and forth going on with the government. And yet you are very next to the governor in the executive decision making. By and large, you can't do anything without governor's approval, but at least you do have an important say and can shape the internal and the external debate. In my case, I was a fairly vocal deputy governor, so I wrote speeches, I put them out. In fact, for a while, I was actually the public face of the battle on the non-performing assets, setting up a public credit registry and so on. I wrote the famous A.D. Shroff memorial speech trying to push for guarding the independence and the operational autonomy of the central bank. Just before I left, I released a speech which was openly talking about how India's fiscal situation might be compromising India's growth and crowding out other borrowers in the system. That speech was not owned by the RBI. It was, in a way, my own views and not the views of the RBI. And I think that is all fine. I think why should a deputy governor necessarily reflect views which are only endorsed by the governor or the rest of the system? They should be allowed to speak. Of course, people realize that a deputy governor has some executive powers, but they also realize a deputy governor is not a governor at the end of the day, that, it doesn't necessarily reflect a governor's views and perceptions. I think what I would push for and what I think probably would be good for the system is that the system should remain open to deputy governors from outside. They don't have to be from outside, but the system should remain open to the idea. Second, I think the deputy governors, especially in charge of research, need to foster creativity. candor and openness in the dissemination of research. If they just do research that is kept inside, it doesn't get the scrutiny and it never lifts itself to a quality that is of the highest type. And I think they have to speak up. I think sometimes it's easier for deputy governors to speak up than for the governor, precisely because they are not in the political mix of things out there. I think I would say in parts of my term, Dr. Rakesh Mohan's assessment was correct. I thought I had the best job at the RBI, but there were parts of my term when I thought it would be better to be the governor than the deputy governor.
So was Dr. Urjit Patel also in your shoes in his term as the deputy governor? Was he also the outside?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, he became the governor, and therefore the position that I took became open. And, I did a video interview with the appointments committee, and, they presumably saw the right things on the CV and they thought I could add value to the function.
So, we also have one question from one of our listeners, Anua Chakrabarti, who was asking a question very much related to what you mentioned, which is, what do you think is the scope of macroeconomic research in India going forward? And if you could also tell us a little bit about the kind of research that takes place within the RBI, given the much better access to data and information that might be privileged information that might be there at the institution, and what kind of talent and researchers are there within the system who can help not just influence policy, but also establish the important academic results and ideas that can serve us for a long time.
See, in terms of macroeconomic research on India, I would say that the most important point I'm trying to convey in the book, which I'm convinced is right factually, is that it's hard to think about Indian macroeconomy without thinking hard about India's fiscal situation. India's fisc is now interacting with all functions of financial sector regulation. And this is why I call fiscal dominance as a theory of everything in India. Of course, I'm exaggerating, but I want to stress it's only a mild exaggeration. It's not a hyperbole at all by any stretch of imagination. It's affecting monetary policy, it's affecting liquidity policy. It's affecting monetary policy because it reduces the transmission of monetary policy when the government is borrowing so much. It affects the liquidity policy, it affects the debt management function, it affects the regulation of banks, it affects the disclosure standards about defaults at the Securities Exchange Board of India, etc. So in my view, macroeconomic research on India has to give big role to understanding the impact of the fiscal on other outcomes and vice versa, the feedback from other outcomes to the fiscal situation of the country. Very often in countries such as United States, the fiscal is never a part of the equation because, the country has a reserve currency. It can keep borrowing at low costs, regardless of what the situation it is in, etc., etc. Even in United States, many macroeconomists now think that the fiscal situation is untenable and that you have to start factoring in it at least for future projections that one is trying to do. So in case of India, given our high levels of deficit, this year they are saying we might hit between 10 to 15% of a consolidated deficit. You can't ignore the fisc. And I think this is the central message I would send for macroeconomic researchers in India. As far as research at RBI is concerned, see, the RBI has excellent staff. It has a mix of PhDs in the Strategic Research Unit department. It has a bunch of masters and undergrad in, economics, statistics, and sometimes even in other disciplines from various Indian universities. They may not always have a PhD, but through the training on the job, they do very interesting research. Of course, their research tends to be more policy focused. The Strategic Research Unit and CAFREL tends to do more academic style research. Most central banks in the world are on both of these tracks. They do very policy oriented, more short-term focused research, and they also allow enough capacity in the institution to do long-term research because that is where the rigor, the depth of understanding, and sometimes the big ideas actually come from. RBI does use the data it has in very clever ways at times. I wished much more of the data was made public and more easily usable by researchers outside, because that would be a way to actually get more inquiries done. There could be more collaborations between RBI researchers and the outside world. And lastly, I would say the one thing that perhaps is a bit lacking is that the RBI researchers don't always have the aspiration for publishing in the top economic journals or top finance journals. Sometimes they are prevented from doing so by the system itself. And then because it isn't clear that this is being encouraged or being rewarded, they then just end up doing what is required inside, because then it's more tangible and might play a bigger role in your career progression, etc. I would like RBI research to be more scrutinized by external referees, being published in journals, so that its level lifts and then it's more serious and rigorous overall. Sometimes there can be a tendency of groupthink in all organizations, not just at the central bank in India. Researchers tend to publish and put out research that looks favorable to the senior management. I think this has to be discouraged at all costs. I think the senior management should keep an arm's length from the researchers. In fact, I would say the strength of the research of a central bank would be when you see a researcher commenting and criticizing in a very objective and open manner the decisions taken by the top management of the central bank. Then you know that the research is not compromised and you are not seeing research that looks charitable or favorable to the top management. So we need more openness, greater rigor and scrutiny, and maybe more researchers in the first place to do the complex interactions of the fisc, the finance, and the real sector of the economy, which I think are playing out in very difficult to fathom fashion right now.
Thank you. And if I can just add, so the RBI in some ways is in a better position than somebody like the Ministry of Finance in having in-house research capacity, right? Because you have dedicated staff and teams. I don't know. I know that we have a chief economic advisor and they now have a team as well. And that's a role that's been on the ascendance over the last decade, perhaps. But RBI perhaps has far deeper research capacity already.
Yeah. Means, the research staff is very large. There are several departments, Department of Economic Policy Research. There's a separate department for monetary policy, which does all the work for the Monetary Policy Committee meetings. There's a whole statistics department separately. And then there is this younger strategic research unit where new PhDs are hired for sort of more long-term research. There's also a financial stability unit that does a fair bit of stress tests and other kinds of financial stability analysis. It produces the financial stability report every 6 months as well. So I would say in terms of capacity, it's much greater at the Reserve Bank of India. And that's credit to the past governors and deputy governors who have really built a very solid institution with emphasis on research. It could be better, it could be more, and it could be more rigorous, as I said. I think the CEAs do a great job with the economic survey, but you will see that many of the chapters are written in consultation with outsiders and with research assistants being hired over there rather than through full-time permanent staff. And that's probably partly the economics of being able to devote funds to the chief economic advisor's office. I think they should have more staff, in my view. It's a very important function. They should be able to do more research to support the finance ministry's decisions. And, it's something that I'm sure is on the table all the time.
Thank you so much, Viral. We'll take a quick break before we continue our conversation today. Before we break, dear listeners, don't forget to listen to this episode on the IVM Podcast Android app, the Adori iOS app, or on your mobile or desktop browsers to get the rich new experience. I would also like to thank the Takshashila Institution and IPSMF, the Independent Public-Spirited Media Foundation, for making the Pragati podcast possible.
नमस्ते, मैं हूँ सौरभ चंद्रा
और मैं प्रणय कोटस्थाने।
जब महफिल खत्म होते होते दरवाजे के बाहर पुलिया के ऊपर हम दुनिया भर की जटिल समस्याओं को सॉल्व करने में लग जाते हैं तो हो जाती है पुलियाबाजी।
अब आजकल के अपार्टमेंट वालों ने तो कभी पुलिया देखी नहीं होगी, पर आप फीलिंग तो समझ ही सकते हैं।
तो आइए शामिल हो जाइए हमारी पुलियाबाजी में, जहां प्रणय और मैं एक से एक इंटरेस्टिंग टॉपिक्स की तह तक जाएंगे।
आर्टिफिशियल इंटेलिजेंस, बिटकॉइन, पाकिस्तान, मेडिकल एजुकेशन, करेंसी क्राइसिस, कभी हम दोनों के साथ और अक्सर स्पेशल एक्सपर्ट गेस्ट की कंपनी में।
सुनिए हमें IVM की वेबसाइट, ऐप या अपने फेवरेट पॉडकास्टिंग प्लेटफॉर्म पर हर दूसरे हफ्ते।
Hi, I'm Pavan Srinath and welcome back to the Pragati podcast. I'm here with Viral Acharya on the second of our 2 episodes with him. And on this episode, we are talking to him about the role of the RBI Deputy Governor. The other thing I want to talk to you about is the conversation we are having right now, the many important speeches that you made in your career, in your tenure while you were there, and the book. And this is also a question that's coming from our listeners. One of our listeners, Sai Krishna V, asks, how important is it for the RBI to communicate directly to the people? Right? So recent governors have made a lot of public speeches, deputy governors such as yourself have also done so. So is the central banker in that sense answerable to the public at large? Or, is the accountability mechanism best left to the political executive? So that's the question from Sai Krishna. And if I may add, having read the book, former Governor Y.V. Reddy mentions in the foreword that in India, it was perhaps during the tenure of Rangarajan where this sort of public role in the 90s with the opening up of the economy became more and more important, because it was important for the RBI governor to also communicate and talk to the markets directly. And if I'm not mistaken, world over, the idea of central bankers talking to the public became important perhaps from the 70s or so, right? So can you shed some light on the legacy and the work how you looked at this?
Yes, I'll make 3 points, Pavan. First, see, in India, in my view, we need to lift the quality of economic discourse to seeing the complexity of India, to seeing the interactions and feedback that happen between different parts of the economy. I again stress that the fisc plays a much bigger role in India than it does in many other countries. And in general, to get more economists and analysts to actually not just analyze individual pieces, but to also connect the dots and see how it is all laying out on the bigger canvas. For this, the central bank should perform actually a research dissemination function. Clearly, speeches given by the top management, deputy governors and governors carry a lot more weight than just individual research pieces. So when important messages have to be sent, important issues are to be discussed, or important decisions have to be justified and some public consensus built around it, it's very important for me that the central bankers communicate. They should not do this in a vacuum. Because, then anything goes if you're not democratically accountable. And I think transparency through public speeches is a part of that accountability, because, you can't just be left accountable to the institutional processes of giving testimonies to the parliament, etc., because those are far and few. And they happen only when certain exceptions arise, such as inflation being violated for more than 3/4 beyond the band of the stipulated band to the Reserve Bank of India and the Monetary Policy Committee. So this is the first point, which is it's important to disseminate, to lift the quality of the discourse and to remain democratically accountable. Second, I would say that the dissemination is also important because sometimes it can lead to meaningful change itself. So it's not just a justification of your decision, but it's actually raising a public debate. The example that Dr. Y.V. Reddy gives of Dr. Rangarajan is this famous Katti Memorial Lecture, which paved the way for the central bank to get out of the automatic financing of government's deficits. So until in 70s, 80s, even early 90s, whenever the government had extra expenditures, RBI just used to buy the ad hoc treasury bills. The government didn't have to go to the market, face consequence in terms of the market discipline on what the borrowing costs.
So it was essentially like printing money.
Yeah, it's printing money, basically. Exactly. And, it has inflationary consequences. It reduces the checks and balances on the fiscal exchequer and so on. And in the Katti Memorial Lecture, Dr. Rangarajan paved the way eventually for the central bank to get out of this and to realize that the Fiscal Responsibility and Budget Management Act might be needed for the government to actually rein its fiscal deficits. Now, that was passed in early 2000s. It was reviewed in 2016. Now, what has happened over the last 5-6 years is that we have been slipping on these targets. And that shows why our outcomes are now beginning to look like pre-Katti Memorial Lectures, so to speak. That, we are beginning to look like we are slipping all the time. The central bank is having to do more and more printing of money to finance the government debts, do more and more open market operations to buy the government bonds so that the yields don't rise. Inflation seems to be rising at the same time. Growth seems to be slipping. Now, are these just coincidences? Or is it that this is your macroeconomic karma, to use the earlier analogy, which is that you have not actually been running a structurally sound operation? You are allowing slippages and then trying to accommodate here and there. But, you can't do so much if you are not structurally right. So sometimes you raise a public debate and bring about important changes. And third and last point I would say is that it forces discipline on the central banker. It's not easy to put out a speech that is coherent, starts from first principles, explains the concept, the problem, the solution, what are its pros and cons, what are the intended and unintended consequences. And, to put out new ideas, to push for reform or to explain what you did in a manner that reaches the common man, or at least the financial sector as a whole, it's not easy. It requires work. It's the difference between chit-chatting and writing something. The moment you write something, you first figure out whether you understand what you're trying to say in the first place, because, writing and editing clarifies the concepts in your own mind. And I think that discipline is very important for central bankers. And therefore, I felt very strongly that most of the content of my speeches should be my own. And that is what I tried to do. Barring the parts where, it's a summary of what has been done, etc. I tried to write almost all of my speeches on my own. In fact, in the preface of the book, I say this was like my lifeblood. This was my voice. This was my advocacy for change. This was the main reason why I wanted to take on this job. And I think I could see that discipline guiding my thinking, guiding my decisions. The fact that I have to publicly speak about what I'm trying to do made me so much more careful in the decision that I was taking. Because otherwise, it's such a powerful position. Paul Tucker, former central banker at the Bank of England, he calls this unelected power. Central bankers have a lot of power. But if you are not disciplined in your thinking, you don't hold yourself to the standards of high democratic accountability and transparency. Anything goes. You can take a lot of actions without actually keeping your own accounts of whether you are doing a good job of it or not. So I think it's very important. I think everyone should hold the central bank accountable by requiring transparency in its decision making. And I think the central bankers, if they adopted such standards, as I've been saying, they can actually sometimes say no when the wrong pressures are being applied, because they can say, I have to explain myself to people at large. I'm a public servant at the end of the day. I have to explain what I'm doing. And I really can't justify taking this action, a clear conscience, and by writing about it truthfully.
So this public communication then becomes a part of the test cricket strategy then, right?
Absolutely.
Because you are bound by what you put out in public. If you're making a U-turn, you have to be able to justify it. So does this public communication sort of help sort of maintain that longer term vision and action and help build consensus?
Absolutely. In fact, this is one of the key reforms also that I mentioned for the central bank in the reforms in the preface chapter of the book, because I say the central bank should hold itself democratically accountable. It should speak truth to power at times. It should sometimes say, no, that this is not in public interest. I won't be able to accommodate every single pressure that's applied on.
I remember still, I think Professor Raghuram Rajan, when he took charge, I think this was after the taper tantrum, and it sort of felt in the public domain that like, here's an adult who's, now in charge, I think his initial speech was essentially saying that we will do what is needed, keep calm, to me, that was the takeaway, it was this assurance. And I think materially helped the economy in certain way beyond. And then, of course, the follow-through was important, but I think just that speech made a difference.
Yeah, I think sometimes central bankers are using their voice to build confidence, to build credibility in their toolkit, to say that they have options available on the table. But you're absolutely right. You can't just do cheap talk. You have to follow it up with actions. And, I would say actions in the end do speak louder than words. So communication is an add-on. I would not say that communication has to be your primary policy through which you achieve outcomes, because after a while, people will start seeing through that, this is just vacuous and there are no actions backing these communications in the first place.
Certainly. So, Viral, before I let you go, one final thought. So now that, I think it's been a little over a year since you finished your tenure at RBI, how do you have to conduct yourself while you're there and after office, given that you have access when you're in office to a lot of privileged information? Every word that you say might be interpreted by people about, the rates might go up, the rate, on the repo front or anything else. Every word matters, right? Even though none of that is actually a piece of legislation that is printed and on paper. So how do you see that responsibility while you were in office and now that you're back in an academic position outside of the RBI?
Yeah, I would say your every word clearly matters a lot more when you are in office. As I said, deputy governors are seen to be important, even if they are only secondary and substantially secondary to the governors. And, it depends on the freedom that the deputy governors are given by specific governors. They may be very important or not so important at certain points of time. But clearly, while you're on the job, your communication and choice of words, etc., is scrutinized a lot more and they can play a significant role. I always try to keep a simple policy, which is that you have to do the right thing. Sometimes the markets may not like it. A couple of my speeches especially on the bond market, betting on interest rates by the banks were not liked. My A.D. Shroff Memorial Lecture was not liked by parts of the government that time. I think, you don't have to, if you're pleasing everyone all the time, you're probably not doing your job right, in my view. You have to sometimes be willing to speak up and stand for the right thing. And I think you have to continue doing that after office. There's an implicit 1-year cooling off period. So my book was released almost on the 1-year anniversary of my term ending. I think in a way, most deputy governors and governors do speak freely thereafter. Some have even written very detailed memoir telling all so to speak. Some have chosen to just summarize their speeches and give some prelude, as I have done in my book. These are different choices, but I think the key thing is that your voice is important. It does carry some weight even afterwards. And you have to use it judiciously, as I said, sometimes to explain what you did, why it was important, sometimes to raise a public debate, and third, to sometimes raise questions that people may not be raising because everyone is caught up in a bit of a group thing or something like that. But, one thing I would stress as the final word, Pavan, is that these jobs may look very glamorous and etc. from outside. At the end of the day, it's just like any other job. I'll be very honest with you. I remember the movie Gandhi, where there's a scene in South Africa where he started actually doing the work of the Harijan and cleaning toilets. And he tells Kasturba that, while I'm doing it, while I'm cleaning the toilet, it seems as important as the law. Gandhi was a barrister, of course. And so it's the same thing, it's just like any other job. You try to do it the best you can. I don't think every day when you get into the office, you realize that, I'm the deputy governor of the central bank or I'm the governor of the central bank. I do my research. I play my tennis. I listen to my music as seriously as I was doing the job of a deputy governor. You want to do it right. You want to make a difference where you can. You want to be able to sleep at night without a regret that you could do something to make India or the world a better place, and that you did everything you could to make that happen. So yeah, I think you want to continue on that journey beyond your office because it's just another job. And your bigger task of, I think, doing the right thing for the country doesn't change whether you are in the position or whether you're outside the position. Your tools change, the powers that you have change. But I think the dhya or the lakshya is the same. And so, as I keep saying, the Hrithik Roshan song, Lakshya ko har haal mein pana hai. So for me, it is restoring India's financial stability, getting public sector banks to be in a better shape, or, I'll keep trying my bit until we finally break through. Sometimes people used to joke at RBI that, when they saw my face when I was proposing a reform, it's almost as though my optimism knew no bounds. And I would like to think that I can maintain that, I can keep that up because, you have to push for change. It's only if you believe in what needs to change that others can champion the idea and take it further.
Certainly. Viral, thank you so much for taking time to record 2 episodes with us on the Pragati podcast. And thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Pavan. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
All the best to you and to all the listeners and their families in these challenging times. As I said, things are on recovery, and I hope around you they continue to recover well in terms of COVID spread going forward.
Thank you, Viral. You too.
Thank you for staying with us till the end. If you have any questions or comments, do write in to podcast@thinkpragati.com. And hey, if you like the podcast and listen to us on iTunes or Apple Podcasts, please leave us a rating and a review. It'll mean a lot to us. The Pragati podcast is available on the IVM podcast app and pretty much every other podcast app and platform. We are there everywhere.
Beta, did you know 79% of all scientists in NASA are Indian only?
देखो, इंडिया में टैक्स सिर्फ मिडिल क्लास भरती है. Everyone is just enjoying free यार.
आजकल के youngsters are only interested in partying and enjoying. उनको देश की पड़ी ही नहीं है.
बेटा तुम बस शादी कर लो, उसके बाद तो you can enjoy life like anything.
I will tell you what this country needs. This country needs 15 years of dictatorship. That is the only way to become a superpower. See the Chinese, how much they've progressed.
सुनो, तुमने ये WhatsApp forward देखा?
So what's common between all of these statements?
They're all absolutely rubbish.
Fake WhatsApp forwards that spread like wildfire.
And statements that defy any logic.
They are here to debunk them all.
Way of family WhatsApp groups, worst nightmare. Where what happens when you read a book.
Basically, we are just a bunch of guys who want to cut through the bullshit of everyone saying this, how it won't be true.
So that the next time someone confidently squeezes out some WhatsApp or Twitter BS, you can look them dead in the eye and go, Uncle, please sit.
So join me, Joel,
and me, Tushar,
every Mondays for a fresh new episode of Uncle, Please Sit.
Advertising is dead. Yep, you heard me right. Advertising is dead. We're all in the content business now. Let's not call it news, TV, radio, etc., etc. It's all content, and we're in the middle of this weirdly exciting phase where all the borders and lines that have been drawn over decades has been swept away by this lovely thing called the internet. We're a show where we don't dwell on just the stuff that is now, but rather the wider stuff about advertising, media, content, and the whole goddamn circus surrounding it. Tune in every Tuesday for our weekly unboxing of the mystery box we used to call advertising. I'm Varun Dugirala, co-founder and content chief at The Glitch, and this is my new podcast, Advertising is Dead.